So, good afternoon, everyone. So, this is part of the ISID Research Seminar Series. We usually organize research seminars on topics related to industrial development. And the usual format is someone would be presenting a paper, which is of ideally within 20-25 minutes, followed by a panel of experts who would be commenting on the paper. Now, today's discussion is on rural non-farm employment in India, shift or diversification. And we are very happy to have Professor Vinod Abraham, who is a professor at Center for Development Studies. Uh, he would be presenting his most recent work on this non-farm employment in India, uh, followed by a panel which includes Professor Mamgen, Dr. Mrinalini Jha, and Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh. But first of all, let me take the pleasure of introducing the speaker and the panelists. Professor Vinod Abraham, as I said, that he is currently professor at Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. He has worked extensively on employment and labor issues. He has done projects with UNCTAD, ADB, ILO, Planning Commission of India, European Commission for Research and Development. He is currently an expert in the research group constituted by Niti Aayog on gig and platform workers in India. He has published quite a good number of papers on labor and employment, which all of us know. And his contribution in the field of employment and labor is very well acknowledged. We are all very much we use those work which Professor Vinod has been doing for quite some time. We are very happy and really delighted that he agreed to make a presentation on his recent work on rural non-farm employment in India. In the panel, we have Professor Rajendra Prasad Mamgen, who is currently professor and head School of Social Sciences in Doon University in Dehradun. He held the prestigious S.R. Shankaran Chair of National Institute of Rural Development. He was also formerly director of Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. He was also professor at Giri Institute of Development Studies, Lucknow, and Institute of Human Development, New Delhi. He's one of the known experts on rural non-farm employment and also on employment migration in the hill economy. We have with us Dr. Mrinalini Jha, who is assistant professor at the Jindal School of Banking and Finance at OP Jindal Global University. She is also a postdoctoral fellow at the Azim Premji University. She works on inequality and labor incomes and also published a quite number of papers on labor and employment and labor income issues. We have with us Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh, who is our own colleague at ISID. She's assistant professor at ISID. Her specialization is on informality. She has worked on MSME sector and particularly in recent period, the impact of COVID-19 on MSME sector, and also how the small enterprises faced GST. That was one of her work during the recent period. So without much ado, I request Professor Vinod to make his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Tikiji. Thank you, ISID, for this opportunity to share a few of my thoughts with regard to rural non-farm sector employment. It's indeed a privilege to be speaking to this audience, and especially on the ISID platform. As I had told earlier, this was my first place of work, and because I moved out from ISID a long time back, but I still have very fond memories about ISID being my first workplace as such. Now, today, what I'm going to focus on is basically a story that is pretty well known. That is the shift in employment from rural agriculture sector to non-agriculture sector as such. But what probably my additional contribution would be to look into the way in households are shifting, the way in which households have shifted from farm to non-farm sector, and the rise of what I call as mixed activity households, where households are not independent, they are not completely moving away from agriculture, but they are not completely getting into rural non-farm sector also. But the rise of what we call as a mixed households, that's one of the things that I would like to kind of highlight. And then also I would like to highlight the link between the rural and the urban in the context of the nature of the rural non-farm sector, where uh, theoretically at least the link between the rural and the urban becomes very important. And I would try to highlight towards the end of my presentation a kind of a policy dilemma that one would be ending up with, as to a choice dilemma as to which is the direction that we should be picking up as policymakers when we are speaking about the growth of or the promotion of rural non-farm sector assets. So with that kind of an introduction, let me just take you to these slides that I have prepared. And when my time is over, Satyaki ji, please give me some indication. I have about 3-4 minutes left.
Okay, okay.
Let me just take my slides. Is it visible now?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yeah.
So this is the title that I have put: the slow emergence of rural non-farm sector employment in India, shift or diversification. When I speak rural non-farm sector, I uh, identify the entire agriculture primary sector as non-farm sector. So I'm not making any distinction between uh, on-farm, off-farm, agricultural, or other primary activities. When I say non-farm, it essentially means non-agricultural activities. So it is only a convenience term that I have used it as non-farm, but I essentially use the term to identify non-agricultural sector. That's a clarification that I would like to make in this. Now, I have termed it the slow emergence of the rural non-farm sector. Essentially, this is a known feature about the agriculture, the employment structure in India, where there has been a rise. There is a mobility of the share of employment from agriculture to the non-agriculture sector, but the movement has been quite slow. The share of persons that has moved out from agriculture to non-agriculture sector has been quite slow. Uh, so I have termed it as the slow emergence of rural non-farm sector. The other term, shift or diversification, I will be able to explain in a minute after I take you through some of the things that I want to speak about. This is what my outline would look like, some theoretical background, then emerging trends and patterns in rural employment, then rural non-farm employment from a time perspective, then types of households, as I was describing earlier, then household types and consumption deciles, looking at the linkage between different types of households and the consumption, where do they belong to, then their nature of work, then the land possession and household types, and certain urban rural linkages, and what kind of conclusions we can draw from this. So this is broadly what I will be speaking about. Now, taking through the theoretical background for this particular paper, we all know this thing, that there are at least three broad stories, three broad angles from where we can look at this shift in the rural non-farm sector employment as such. The first and the most popular story is about the structural transformation story and the link between structural transformation and the rise of the rural non-farm employment. I call it as the mobility story, essentially because there is the rise of rural non-farm sector is associated with income mobility as such. There is going to be when the rural non-farm sector grows, along with that there is expected income increase, and that is kind of there would be some kind of income mobility as such. So it is an occupational mobility, but that mobility also would be associated with some form of income mobility. Where does it come from? We all know the structural transformation story, both the demand and supply side story. The demand side story essentially coming from the Fisher and Clark arguments of rising income leading to changes in the consumption basket. Then the consumption patterns, the composition of food consumption changes from food to non-food, and they shift towards non-food goods and services as such as the income rises. Right? Now, rise in the agricultural income during this particular period enhances the demand for goods and goods, essentially the goods that are produced in the urban centers. But there are a large rise in the non-tradable services in the rural areas also. And it is through this, the demand for the non-tradable services in the rural areas that essentially the demand side story of structural transformation alludes to their rise in the rural non-farm sector employment. That's the demand side story. But the supply side story is slightly different. Supply side story of structural transformation essentially says that transformation occurs because of the interlinkages between the rural agriculture sector and the urban industrial sector. Now, rural non-farm sector is essentially the source of inputs, essentially labor, raw materials, and the intermediate goods for the interlinkages that develops between the rural agriculture sector and the urban industrial sector. Now, the growth of the urban industrial sector is essentially the point from where the rural non-farm sector finds its sources of growth. Essentially, the growth of the urban industrial sector itself is what the inputs that is required for the urban industrial sector is what creates the rise of the rural non-farm sector. Both these stories, both this demand and supply side stories would essentially would claim that there would be mobility, occupational mobility, that is, people would be moving out from agriculture to non-agriculture sector into occupations that are in the non-agriculture sector, which are of higher incomes as well. So that is broadly, we can call it as the mobility story. As against the mobility story, there is another version of the rise of the rural non-farm sector, what I call as the risk aversion argument as such. Now, essentially, this group of people who argues this essentially call this as the response of rural non-farm sector employment essentially as a response to agricultural shocks. Now, vagaries in the agriculture sector leading to large income shocks, that is sudden fall of sudden shocks that are occurring in the agriculture sector essentially could be natural, or it could be because of other economic shocks, price related, productivity related, any form of economic shocks, leading to income fall or income, a sudden fall in income or a gradual fall in income also. Now, in such cases, livelihood diversification is used as a consumption smoothing strategy. Here, what is essentially occurring is that you are using the movement from agriculture to non-agriculture sector as a risk aversion strategy rather than a mobility argument. The earlier story was about moving from one income level to another income here. Here, it is essentially probably to remain at the same level of income, but essentially ensuring that you get some form of income that you are earning. So essentially, you would diversify your livelihood and try to keep your consumption at the same level as it was here. Now, multiple sources of income act as an insurance against shocks as such, and rural non-farm sector employment becomes an additional employment along with agriculture. Now, this is where I would like to make the distinction between shift and diversification. The earlier story of mobility is essentially a shift in employment from agriculture to non-agriculture sector, while the risk aversion story is essentially a diversification story. That is, you keep your earlier sources of employment, but you actually enter into multiple sources of employment. So this is a different strategy compared to the earlier one that we were talking about. A third possibility is agriculture distress and rural non-farm employment. That is, a rural non-farm employment acting as an employer of the last resort. Now, consistently poor agriculture performance. Now, earlier when we were talking about I was talking about risk aversion. Essentially, those are shocks of some forms of shocks that occur in an economy generally functioning okay, right? But now, in an economy where agriculture starts performing consistently poorly, and the prices and the productivity, either through fall in prices or low productivity, any form of poor performance in the agriculture sector as such, which would mean that in the long run, insufficient income generation from agriculture for households as such. Now, the response would be movement from agriculture to rural non-agriculture sector, often along with migration as a. So rural non-farm employment in this particular case would be like a seasonal activity. There might be at times during the year or during a particular period of time, people may be moving out of agriculture and moving out of the particular region also. So there would be occupational change as well as geographical mobility, migration essentially for short periods of time and coming back to the same sector. So there would be a mix of activity of both rural non-farm as well as farm activity during a particular period of time, and rural non-farm sector employment probably would be a seasonal activity as such. Right? So at least these three versions we can think about. That is, one is the mobility story, the other is the risk aversion story, and third is the employer of the last resort story. Now, the idea was to kind of give a broad theoretical background as to what could happen, what are the possibilities. And now what I'm going to do is to look at some data and then show how things look up and where do we fit in which particular broad argument can the change in or the rise in rural non-farm sector in India look like. That's what I would want to basically take you through. So this I have just said this thing. So the rural non-farm sector, I told you there can be shift or diversification. These can be two aspects. That is shift when the unit of analysis, it moves from one particular occupation to another occupation, in this case from farm to non-farm as such. And diversification when the same unit of analysis is involved in more than one activities, multiple activities as such. Now, the unit of analysis can be two units actually. One can be the household and the other can be the individual. Essentially, it would mean that the individual can be shifting, the individual can have diversified sorts of activities. Also, the household can be shifting and the household can have a diversified set of activities. Now from this we can think of combinations of possibilities, like individual is shifting, but the household is diversifying. And the other way around, you can think of various possibilities. That is, the individual may be shifting from one particular activity to another, but the household itself is actually a diversified set of households. You have multiple activities within the household, or it could be that the individual is shifting and the household is also shifting. So all these possible combinations are possible. It can be kind of thought of as these can be analytically kind of thought of as this kind of shifts, where individual is shifting, diversifying, and the household is shifting and diversifying. So that's kind of analytical background that I wanted to kind of please. Now, before I take you through this analytical story, let me take you through what are the broad trends in the rural sector in terms of shift in employment and all. Then we'll come back to this story that with regard to the shift in the rural non-farm sector. Now, if you look at the long-term trends in the industrial distribution of workers, rural males and rural females. I mean, this shift, the slow shift that I was talking about, it is visible in this particular graph. You can see that if you take from the period 1977 to 2020-21, the share of agriculture, at least till the period 1999-2000, you can see that it is more or it is declining, but very, very gradual decline. Actually, from 80%, it has declined to probably about 77 or 76%. But since 1999-2000, there is actually an acceleration in the way in which the share of agriculture has been declining, slightly faster than the earlier periods, but still we have a majority of employment in the rural areas still coming in the agriculture sector for the rural males as such, right? Now, during this period from 77 to say 99-2000, there has been a gradual decline in the agriculture sector. But the rising sector along during this period, if you look at the corresponding rising sector is actually, if you look at the largest sector is other sectors, which largely consists of services. And then we have rural manufacturing as an important sector that is present over there, right? But after 99-2000, if you look at the contribution of manufacturing kind of starts shrinking, and construction becomes a singular source of employment that is rising. Construction sector becomes the most important source of employment, with some rise during 2011, 12 to 17, 18 for other forms of services as such, which again starts falling during the period 17, 18 to 2021. So essentially, construction is the singular largest non-farm source of employment apart from agriculture for rural males after the 1999-2000 onwards. While rural manufacturing, which had some promise earlier, that seems to have disappeared. in the after the 99 2000 onwards. The story is somewhat very similar in case of rural females also, just that the shift to construction employment starts slightly later in 2004-5 onwards, and you can start seeing that the share of employment in construction starts expanding, while that of the rural manufacturing sector, which had a substantial presence, or substantial meaning, compared to any other sector apart from agriculture, which was the most important source of employment for rural females, that is more or less stagnant. It remains the same, but does not seem to be growing at any point, except for the year probably 2011-12, which had some kind of an expansion, which falls back in the subsequent periods itself. But the biggest source of employment in non-agriculture sector is essentially construction, which is pretty much known also, that construction is the most important source of employment as such, growing source of employment in the agriculture, in the rural areas, other than in the agriculture sector. Now, a simple decomposition of what I had shown you now, if you look at the simple decomposition of the total employment shares during this particular period, it can be very easily seen that the employment, the table over there, so the change in the employment share is marked for each of these 5-year periods, starting from 77 to, not 5 years, sorry, roughly 10-year decadal this thing. There is a decline in the share of agricultural employment, but you can see that decline is now decomposed for the 4 sectors that I had mentioned, 3 sectors that I had mentioned, and you can see for construction, all the employment, whatever decline is occurring, is completely compensated by construction sector by 2011-12 to 2021, right? And it is the same case where, if you look at in case of for both for rural males and females. So the entire rise in employment, non-farm employment, is actually in the construction sector. That's the basic story that we need to look at in the first part. Now, getting into the construction sector, if you look at the big rise in the construction sector employment, I just focus on this period 99 2000 to 2021, where we have seen the largest rise in the construction sector employment. We know that the data, with regard to employment in India, provided by National Sample Surveys and the Periodic Labor Force Surveys, gives you these 3 definitions: the usual principal subsidiary status, usual principal status, and the usual subsidiary status. Now, I have measured the share of employment, both for males and females, in the construction sector using all the 3 measures, that is the usual principal status, usual principal and subsidiary status, and usual subsidiary status also. Now, in this table, it is important, can be noted that, of course, between 99 2000 and 2021, there is a rise in share of employment, both for males and females. And the rise is visible in case of usual principal and subsidiary status as such. Right? There is a large rise from about 5% for males. It roughly reaches to about 17% for males, and from about 1% for females in 99 2000, it increases to about 12% in this thing. But this rise, if you look at the employment rise, both for males and females, a substantially larger rise in employment is actually in the subsidiary status of employment rather than in the primary status of employment. Because the overall employment is actually in usual principal and subsidiary status, but what is actually the largest rise is actually in subsidiary forms of employment rather than principal status forms of employment. What this essentially means is construction is becoming an important source of employment, non-farm source of employment, but that is not a full-time activity as such. It seems to be an activity that is to be done. That is a kind of a subsidiary form of activity that is done both by males and females. So the rise of construction and construction as a subsidiary activity seems to be the major form of employment that seems to be rising. Now, in order to understand further, because this subsidiary employment essentially means that we are actually now looking at not a permanent form of employment, but some kind of an employment that is secondary, subsidiary, which is probably flexible. We don't know what is the kind of nature of that particular type of employment, right? So we get further into this thing. We actually look into what I do now is actually further get into this data and then look at, it is possible to look at how much time that is spent on a particular activity. When you say that your usual principal and subsidiary status may be belonging to a particular industrial activity, but the same person can be identified on the basis of how much time actually is spent on this particular activity itself, right? How much time in the sense of using what we call based on your principal and subsidiary status asset. Now, for example, in this table, if you look at 99 to 2000, what is given over here is that in 99 2000, those persons who had spent to, who had spent their time in agriculture, for instance, okay, who had claimed that they had worked their time in agriculture, 76.4% of their time, of their usual principal status, UPS status, was in agriculture sector. But over a period of time, if you look at that particular thing, is between 99 2000 and 2011-12, there is a sharp drop between the share of time that is spent in UPS, that is dropping. And in place of that, you would see this thing, that the time that is spent on agriculture, the construction sector, that has increased from 3.3% to 16%, and then it consistently remains over there, right? Now, the rest of the time is distributed. That is, if I say 76.4 in 99 2000, the rest of the time is divided. Of the total time that is available, it is divided between different sectors. And you can see that the time that is increasing is only in case of the construction sector, and no other sector seems to have any substantial rise in this thing, in the time that is spent on that particular activity. Now, I take only the agriculture sector. Now, it is possible to look at the agriculture, each of these sectors, what I had explained earlier for the last table. It is possible to look at how much time is spent on each of these activities by cross-tabulating between usual principal status and current daily status. Now, usual principal status is a measure of how many days a person is working in a particular activity, right? So if you say that if you have spent more than half the year you have spent in a particular activity, then your usual principal status is considered to be belonging to that particular activity, right? But current daily status measures how many days in the last 1 week you have spent in a particular activity. Now, if it is possible to measure the last 1 week's, keeping last 1 week as the reference period for current daily status, and compare it with the usual principal status. Okay, if you measure it like this, and then if you start comparing, only I've just taken the agriculture activity. A person, if he's claiming that he belongs to the agriculture sector on the basis of the UPSS status, I look at what is his current daily status. Okay, now what you see is this thing. In 99 2000, a person claiming that he works in the agriculture sector, 96.7% of the CDS time, that is the current daily status time, is spent in agriculture itself. So the activity, that person, when he says that his usual principal status is a particular activity, his current daily status also is somewhat very similar. He remains in the same particular activity itself, right? But by 2020-21, if you look at this, the time that is spent in current daily in the usual principal status person, only 86% of his time is spent in agriculture sector, while time spent in other sectors have started increasing. In other words, for each individual, that the time spent in that particular agricultural activity is actually falling, and the activity spent in other sectors are increasing. So for each individual, there seems to be a mixing of activity that is coming up, right? And essentially, if you look at it, is actually in the construction sector that you see the largest rise. So what I'm trying to bring in terms of data is that there is a mixing of activity that is between agriculture and construction. People seems to be shifting between construction and agricultural activities. It is not shifting in the sense that there seems to be diversifying between agriculture and construction, rather than moving away from agriculture to construction as the activity, but there seems to be taking up both these activities together, with agriculture and construction as the activities. Now, from the data that I had shown earlier, now it is possible to divide the time on the basis of UPSS and CDS, current daily status time. It is possible to show for each person, or the typical of the total time that of the total number of days that is spent in agriculture, what share of people are spending their time in agriculture, and what share of the total persons are spending their time in agriculture, and then you would be able to get some sense of how much of that time is also being spent in agriculture versus non-agriculture. Now, in 99 2000, for example, about 77 or 70 about roughly about 72 or 73% of the total workforce is engaged in agriculture sector, and roughly the same number, about 90% of the same workers are involved in their, according to CDS status, also involved in agriculture sector. Now, in 2011-12, the share of UPSS persons have actually declined from roughly about 74%, roughly to about slightly above 55% or so, right? But the point over there, if you look at the line over there, which shows, it shows the time, the amount of time that is spent by agriculture workers in non-agricultural activities is the gap that is showing between the blue bar, the blue part of the bar and the line over there for 2011-12. Essentially, it would mean that among agriculture, what I'm trying to draw to is that among the agriculture workers whom we identify as agriculture workers, at least some time is being spent on non-agricultural activities as such. Okay, so in terms of time dimension also, one would be able to see that workers who identify themselves as agriculture workers actually are spending some part of their time in non-agricultural activities, and most of this time is spent in construction sector as such. Now, that was the individuals that we were looking at. Now, if I classify the households into three types, how do I classify the households? The households, I classify them into three types. That is an agriculture household, a non-agriculture household, and a mixed household. Now, what are these households essentially? I define an agriculture household as a household where all the working members of the household are involved in agriculture sector. That's how I define an agriculture household. In a non-agriculture sector household is defined as where all the members of the household are working in, all the working members of the household are working in some non-agricultural sources of employment. And if there is a mix of both agriculture and non-agricultural employment, then I call them as mixed households. Right? So earlier dimension that we were talking about was about the individuals. Now we are getting into looking at the households themselves. Now, comparing from 99 2000 to 2021, between these three types of households, you can see that about 66% of all households were agriculture households. About 22% of them were non-agriculture households, and roughly about 11.6% were mixed households. Over the period of time, you can see between 99 2000 and 2021, from 66%, only 26% of the households are pure agriculture households. Right? What we call as pure agriculture households are only 26%. Now, earlier we had seen that roughly about 50% of the population is still working in agriculture, right? But in terms of households, if you look at that the share of households that are actually focused in agriculture, that has declined, has considerably declined, and the share of non-agriculture households has increased substantially. From 21%, they have increased to roughly about 35% of the households, right? And mixed households, which was kind of stagnant from 11% till 2017-18, only about 12% were considered to be mixed households. By 2021, there is a sudden jump to about 38% as such. Now, it is a possibility that between 2017-18 and 2021, there is this large, if you can look at the data, there is a large shift between 1990 and 2017-18, actually it is somewhat, there is a gradual decline from 66% to 51% for agriculture households. But between 17-18 and 2021, there is a sudden drop from 51 to 26% and sudden rise in the mixed households, right? But the non-agriculture households actually has not increased much during this particular phase. Possibly, I'm not very sure, possibly it is a response to COVID. That is, the number of households, that is mixed households, have increased, while the pure agriculture households have declined. And that seems to be a diversification strategy that I was talking about earlier, that when there is an income shock, household seems to be taking up multiple activities rather than moving out of one particular activity. There seems to be moving into multiple activities. There seems to be some sign of that, but I'm not very sure. I mean, at this point, we cannot be very sure about this. There is need for further analysis. But anyway, the point that is over the long-term trend seems to be that households are certainly moving out from agriculture as an activity. Entire households are moving out from agriculture as an activity, and entire households are moving into non-agricultural activities as such. While in the recent period, we do see a rise of the mixed income households as such. Now, if you look at these households, and one second. If you look at these households, that is these agriculture households, non-agriculture households, and mixed households as such, and then we look at their current daily status, farm activity, non-farm activity, and mixed activity. So this will give you what individuals are doing within households as such, right? So this is the idea that I was trying to draw in, that you can have households that are diversified or what we call as shifted out as such. Now, to get a sense of that, we look at individuals within households and get an average picture about this. Basically, looking at the current daily status activity share by household types. Now, if you look at the three types of in the agriculture household in 99-2000, about almost the entire household was involved in agricultural activity itself. In the 99-2000, the first graph, the first panel, the first bar over there shows that 99-2000, almost the entire activity was done by the agriculture household was purely agricultural activity or farm activities themselves. By 2011-12, you can see that there is a kind of diversification that is going on, right? That is, you can see some part of the agricultural activities that is done by the agriculture households have declined to about 50%, and the rest of the time is actually spent on non-agricultural activities. Now, in 2017-18, there is a decline of such activities, but 2021, again, you can see that the mixing up of activities that is occurring within the agricultural households itself. So essentially, what we call as agricultural households, where all the members who claim themselves to be agriculture workers as their principal status, they are having a mixture of activities that can be either non-farm or mixed activity within the agricultural households itself as subsidiary activities. So even when we call them as agriculture households, there is a large share of non-farm mixed activity as subsidiary forms of activity that is going on within these agriculture households. Now, take the case of non-agricultural households.
Oh, Vinod. Oh,
yes.
Sorry. Can you wrap up within 3-4 minutes?
Yes. I think I'll have to really rush.
No.
Okay. Let me just take you through some of these things and then I'll stop it over there. If you look at the non-agricultural households, you can see that this kind of a mixing up of activity is not there much actually. It is only in the agriculture household you would find that this the mixing up of activity that is increasing, while in the non-agricultural households, which had a substantial share of non-farm work as their principal source of employment itself, that continues to be there till 2017-18, and there is some kind of a mixing up that is occurring during 2021. But generally, what we can see, it is more or less a stable form of employment. That is, non-agricultural households seems to be engaged in non-agricultural activities throughout the period as such, right? Now, mixed households, if you look at mixed households also, you would find that they have a mixture of activities. They have if you take the total number of households, number of members in the households, about half of these members' time was spent on agricultural activities, and about half the time was spent on non-agricultural activities. That is the kind of mixture that you see, and that seems to be consistent. You can't say it is the same across all the period, but there seems to be some kind of the mixed activity household seems to be having a mixed kind of pattern itself. Now, essentially, what I'm trying to point is that a small share of households are mixed activity households. Increasingly large number of households are becoming non-agriculture households, but these non-agriculture households are doing entirely non-agricultural activities. Well, agriculture households, what we claim as agricultural households, are actually within the, even though their principal status of work is actually agriculture, they are entering into a lot of mixed activities as such. Okay, let me skip some of these things. I will just take you through some other interesting parts, and then I will wrap up some of these arguments. I don't have the time to. Just let me take you through, just to get a sense about what these households look like. Now, I had described these three types of households. That is the agriculture household, the non-agriculture household, and the mixed households in the mixed households. And this is the consumption expenditure per capita, the density. I've just drawn a kernel density of real consumption per capita expenditure, and comparing between these three groups, that is the agriculture households, non-agriculture households, and the mixed households as such. And the year given is for 99-2000 as such. Initial year that I have taken, and you can see this, that from the distribution it can be kind of seen that the non-agriculture households in general do better. That is, they have a higher income in general. Their average income is higher, and the distribution also seems to be towards a higher income group compared to the agriculture. The agriculture seems to be the poorest in the group, with the largest share of people having the lowest income group, and generally poorer than the rest of the group as such, right? That's what we can see from the kernel density. Both, in terms of some form of ranking, we can see that the agriculture households are the poorest. The mixed seems to be in middle, and the non-agriculture household seems to be the richest in this particular during this period as such. Now, if we compare the same thing for the next period, that is 2020, that is 2021, the latest period as such, the pattern seems to remain more or less the same. That is, the non-agriculture employment, the non-agriculture household still seems to be the richest. They seems to be have a better distribution in terms of a larger share of people getting higher levels of income compared to both mixed and the non-agricultural income. But an interesting change that we see is that the incomes in general, the income distribution seems to have moved for the agriculture sector, for the agriculture households, and both the agriculture household and the mixed households, in terms of income distribution, starts looking very similar, right? Their distribution seems to be very similar compared to the earlier period. In other words, what I'm trying to point is that there is a kind of a strategy that is being used by agriculture households. They are agriculture households, but they seems to be moving in a direction of mixed households, and that seems to be paying in terms of better incomes for the agriculture households in terms of by diversifying their sources of livelihood as well. They are not actually becoming non-agriculture households. They are either remaining as mixed households or principally doing agriculture work as such, but they do seems to be getting involved in non-agricultural activities as such. Now, yes, so I don't have time for this thing. So let me just take you through the last piece of activity that I want. Yeah, this is another interesting probably interesting thing to just speak about for a minute. That is the land possessed by these three groups of people that I was talking about. This is the land distribution that I have drawn using different data sources. The 99, 2000, 2011, 12 comes from the Employment and Unemployment Service, and 13 and 18 come from the Situational Assessment Service, right? Now, this is the average distribution of land that looks for by household types as such. Now, let me just take you to the interesting part. This is based on size classification as such. Let me just take you to the interesting part in this thing. This is the share of land possessed by different types of households, right? Agriculture house of the total land that is held by different types of households. If you look at between 1999 2000 and 2011-12, there is a substantial shift in the land share of land that is held by different types of households. If you look at who holds land, is actually the increase in land is actually in the non-agricultural households. That is, in households where there is zero agricultural activities. They are the households that are actually starting to start holding land, while those agriculture households which were doing agriculture as their singular activity, their share of land seems to have fallen. It has declined from about 60, holding about 65% of all the land. It has declined to roughly about 55% of the total land, while non-agricultural households, which was holding about 20% of the total land, that has increased to 33%. Now, it is only speculative, but we can only say this, but it seems to be that land is becoming a different type of an asset compared to what it was earlier. Agriculture as an activity seems to be declining. It is, as I had shown, and mixed types of activity seems to be becoming important. Construction seems to be becoming an important way of diversifying. Agriculture itself seems to be declining. Non-agriculture sector is becoming important in terms of employment, but land as an asset, that use seems to be also very different now. From what used to be a productive asset, probably it is moving into something else. Probably speculative, becoming a speculative asset as such. Probably the land prices, that is becoming a way of holding on to land. So, otherwise, what is the explanation that one can give for rising land holding among the non-agricultural households? These are households which don't have any agricultural activities at all. So that is something that is interesting. Well, among the mixed households also, we do actually see a decline in the total land. So that is with regard to the land possession. And let me just now, this is across different the size categories and all. But just to point out that if you look at the size, total land that is held by non-agricultural households, across size classifications, you do see there is a rise in the share. It is not one particular. So if you look at small land sizes, large sizes, whatever size classification that you are talking about, there seems to be a rise in the share of total land that is held by non-agricultural households. So among the small landholders, among the large landholders, across size classification, you do see a rise in the land possession asset. Now, the last point that I would want to make is with regard to the linkages between the rural and urban thing. I really don't think I have time to explain the methods and all here now. What I have finally done is to look at what does agriculture households respond to and non-agriculture and mixed households respond to in terms of the presence of urban. That's what I was wanting to look at. If you are near an urban region, what type of employment response? That is what I wanted to look at. So if you look at these households, these are three types of households. These are three scatter plots that I have drawn, basically looking at the manufacturing employment. The three plots are like this. So one is showing the share of urban population. The first one, second one is showing the manufacturing employment share in the rural areas, and the third one shows the manufacturing share in the urban areas. In the urban areas that is adjacent to the rural areas. So that is the basic way of looking at it. And essentially showing that if you look at the agriculture household, the share of agriculture household seems to be declining as the urban share in that particular region is declining, in a state, for instance, or this is actually district wise that I have done. So if you in a district, if you have a larger share of urban population, then the share of agriculture household seems to be declining in that particular, which is quite obvious. If you have a larger share of urban population in the region, then these rural agriculture households should be declining. And manufacturing share in the rural area seems to be having a negative this thing. But manufacturing share in the urban area, that seems to be having a positive this thing. Essentially trying to link up what I'm saying earlier. That is, if the source of employment, if there seems to be some kind of link between manufacturing employment share and the rural agriculture household. Essentially, what I'm trying to draw is this, that there seems to be some link between the inputs that are drawn for the agriculture, for the urban manufacturing sector, that seems to be coming from the agriculture sector, right? Rural agriculture sector. If you take the non-agriculture households, this is the pattern it looks like. It shows a positive relationship between the urban share of population. Between the rural share, it shows a positive relationship. but it does not show any particular relationship between the urban share or the manufacturing employment share of population assets or manufacturing share of employment assets. But it has the essential point is here is that non-agricultural employment, if you look at the second panel over there, non-agricultural households, the share of non-agricultural households and manufacturing employment share in the rural areas, that seems to be positively correlated. The share of non-agricultural households in the rural areas and manufacturing share in the rural areas seems to be correlated, positively correlated. While the same thing, the share of agriculture households and manufacturing employment share in the rural areas seems to have a negative correlation. Now, this is the policy dilemma that I was trying to draw to you earlier. That is, if you want to shift, if you want the rural non-farm sector to grow, then the link seems to be with the rural manufacturing sector itself. Right? As the share of, if you want greater number of people to move out from agriculture to non-agriculture sector, the key seems to be increasing the share of people in the rural manufacturing sector, right? But that's why it's showing a positive correlation. But if you look at, sorry, no, I'm not taking mixed household. If you look at the agriculture households, if the rural manufacturing share in the rural areas increases, then there is a negative correlation between the agriculture households themselves. That is, as the share of agriculture households increases in a particular region, then the share of rural manufacturing in the sector seems to be declining. Now, what I'm trying to draw is this: there is actually a conflict that is going on here. What is a conflict here? If there is actually a conflict for resources, what is a resource conflict here? Agriculture households actually depend on land as an agricultural source, while rural non-agricultural resources, essentially when we are talking about rural manufacturing, their land is actually used as a natural resource. Essentially, we are talking about mining, minerals, furniture, forestry, these kind of resources. There is a conflict of interest between which particular area to focus. Now, if you want agriculture, if you want rural manufacturing to grow, if rural manufacturing is growing, then there is a possibility that there will be a shift from agriculture to non-agriculture household, right? But if rural manufacturing is growing, then agriculture households will not be, their share of agriculture households would remain higher. So that's the kind of dilemma that I was talking about. These are the sectors. Let me not get into this thing. These are the various sectors that can be seen, which has this conflict and all. When there is during the questionnaire, probably I can discuss more on this. So this is the conflict that I was talking about. You would see that some of these sectors, agro-based, agro-complementary sectors, when they grow, for example, manufacture of food products grow, it is actually agro-based, agro-complementary sector. But when that sector particularly grows, you need to have an agriculture sector growing. You cannot have a rural non-farm sector growing when you are talking about this thing. But something like, for instance, manufacture of wood and wood products, right? It is forest-based, but it is actually competing against the agriculture sector. If you want agriculture sector to grow, that is if you want the forest sector to grow and wood and wood product-based manufacturing to grow, but it is actually taking the space of agriculture sector as well. So there is a conflict over there. How to resolve that? That is a serious concern. So let me just draw my conclusions and I'll stop. In conclusion, slow emergence of rural non-farm sector assets, construction employment as alternative employment, and multiple employment the source seems to be for the rural non-farm sector. Rising time share of non-agriculture work in agricultural employment. The shift period versus there is a shift period versus the diversification period. This later period after 1999-2000, it seems to be more of a diversification period rather than a shift period. Pure agriculture households are reducing and non-agriculture households increasing. In recent years, mixed households seems to be increasing as well. Income distribution and land distribution seems to be increasing with non-agricultural households. Agricultural households and mixed households are increasingly looking similar in terms of income distribution. Rural non-farm sector is associated with rural industrialization, while agriculture associated with urban industrialization. The point is which way to go as such. I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'll give it to the moderator now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Abraham, for this very extensive and very interesting presentation looking into the mobility of rural population moving from farm to non-farm and the nature of employment that is emerging. So, Dr. Mrinalini Jha, since she has indicated that she has to go for another meeting, so I would request her to make her comments on the presentation. And I would request all the panelists to restrict their presentation, to restrict their comments within 5 to 7 minutes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Is it possible for me to share my screen? Can I do that? Okay. Can someone confirm if this is visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay.
Visible.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Abraham. I am actually, I'm thrilled to have finally received your paper, because I think the first time I heard you present this was in ISLE. I think in February, you were talking about this paper. So I will not go over the summary. I had put them together. I'll straight away go to the comments which I had, and a few suggestions, largely based on what I didn't understand. So if you could just help me do that. So my first point was that I understand you have used usual principal subsidiary status and the current daily status to measure the two aspects. So one is the time measure of employment, and the second is the person measure of employment. Now, I thought that the figure you actually showed here as well, the one which has bar graphs and one line trend graph, I thought that the numbers were coming from tables 4 and 5 in the paper that was shared with us. But I was not able to match it. So if you could just tell us later where those numbers are coming from, like how you're calculating the line graph. And I suppose the line graph has to be read from the right axis. So if you could just spend a few minutes on that, that would be great. What I've done is that I've put in brown the statement which I've picked up from the paper. So at some point you mentioned that in the first period, that is about 20 years, no, around a decade, sorry, 10 years, that was the period of shift, which means the people were moving entirely into, say, non-agri household setup. While the period from 1718 to 2021 was a period of diversification, and in the middle it was weakening shift and strengthening diversification. Now, I was wondering if we can think of some mechanisms on why we are seeing this shift was followed by this diversification. And I could think of two, so maybe we could explore this as well. So one is that we say that it started with a shift. Now, what if the shift is happening because we want to maximize our earnings, right? We want to enhance our income. Now, if households are shifting, but it is not resulting in an income enhancement, that could indicate them probably that, well, perhaps we should not leave it altogether, and rather we should just work on move towards diversification. So perhaps that could be one explanation. And the second is that, again, because 2021 is a pandemic year, we were in the thick of the pandemic. What if this diversification is purely due to the pandemic? That because of this added volatility in agriculture, we wanted to expand. And post-pandemic, which means by post-pandemic, I just mean after 2021, which is 21-22, what if the numbers went back? So maybe it will be a nice thing to check for that as well. Then at some point you have written that the share of workers doing farm work, it declined from 49% to 33%, again over the same decade. And it is now at 40%. While the non-farm activities remained at around 50%. Now, this is the person analysis, not the household level, the person level analysis. But when we see that the agricultural households were diversifying, and they were really diversifying by doing more construction work, how do I put together the person story where I'm seeing that farm employment is going up, that people are moving to farm work? How do I put this together with the household story of increasing diversification, which means moving out of agriculture and into non-agriculture? Then the paper reports that the agricultural households are highly diversified, while the non-agricultural households are not. I just wanted to make sure that this actually is in line with our priors, right? Because we are saying that diversification is likely to be seen in agricultural households because risk is greater there. So I want to really distribute my eggs in multiple baskets, and to do that, I am moving to non-agri sources of employment. So I suppose this is in line with our prior. If it's not, if it's contradictory, I would like to just please help me understand how. Then, okay, again, two things are being said. One is that the overall rural household strategy seems to household diversification and individual specialization. So as households, so with individuals within households can be doing different things. But an individual is really spending all their time on one activity. So they're specializing in whatever they're doing. That's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, we are seeing that the households are getting more diversified in terms of agri versus non-agri, but more specialized in terms of the nature of work, which is self-employed versus wage. So, well, while diversification is happening on one account, which is agri, non-agri, mixed, that aspect, specialization also is happening on another account. And is this happening at the household level or the person level? If you could know about that. I thought that in the presentation you had mentioned it was perhaps the table was not there in the paper. If you're providing an average income of wage employee, self-employed, etc., it would help us know if a fall in wage employment is desirable or not. So I saw that you had two tables, one with casual wage and one with salary, like regular wage. So if that is already done, then we can of course check that if the casual wage is going down, then we know it's desirable, else not. So we can, if there was a table with income numbers, that would be nicer. Yeah, another thing I thought we could do was, we have age data as well, because you're working with individual data. So if you can check that if it is the younger members who are the ones moving to non-farm sector, that can again help you get some very nice mechanisms that, well, the older folks know they have their feet into agriculture. But given the volatility and the risks associated with the sector, they are pushing the offsprings or the new folks to not go there and kind of move to non-agri, which will help them diversify at the household level, but specialize at the individual level. So it will fit into the argument that you've been making in the paper. Yeah, okay, just two more. So you're saying that individuals are specializing as households diversify, which means that they are moving to non-agricultural sector. Individuals are moving to non-agricultural sector and they're sticking to it throughout the year. They're not shifting around, which presumably means that the non-agricultural sector is giving them better returns than the agricultural sector, or security, or some desirable thing is coming. Now, I was wondering that if it were so, what is the reason for those individuals in the household who are in agriculture to not switch to non-agriculture? If non-agriculture is something which is like holding on to people and not allowing them to diversify any further, it makes sense for perhaps the other members of the same house to see that and say that, well, that's a better option. Why don't I shift there? Maybe income could actually help me do this. Oh, actually, I'm at the end of it. And I was also wondering, as I was reading the paper, again, it could be different for different people. I was making two comparisons constantly. So I was looking at gender while I was looking at, house agri versus non-agri, agri versus mixed, and a gender thing in that. So maybe if it had two sections of male and then female, maybe it will just be nicer for me to quickly follow it more quickly. But yeah, I mean, all in all, I mean, thank you very much for all that I've learned. This is just, I mean, I'm just asking as a teacher, if you could tell me all that I've missed. I hope it's useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mrinalini, for your very interesting and intriguing questions. I think that in the discussion, Professor Vinod may take up some of these. Now I move to Professor Mamgen for his comments. So, yes, sir.
Let me first thank Professor Satyaki Roy for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this panel discussion, to special seminar. I think, I have met Dr. Binod Abraham since very long, and I really enjoyed. He's my guru bhai, and I also am very happy to see many people, particularly our panelists also, Dr. Mrinalini Jas and Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh. So this is really an occasion for me to share some things, which Professor Binod Abraham has, very painstakingly taken this paper forward. And I think, his paper is really a new addition to the current understanding of the whole situation of rural non-farm employment. What are the kind of strategies different households are adopting, and why this kind of, what he is trying to say, that can shift from agriculture to non-agriculture, and this diversification he's saying later on, how it is basically helping the households. I think, he has put everything in nicely in a kind of theoretical framework. And then he's trying to see that, by taking different time period, he's trying to see that where this shift is going, whether this is a shift or this is a kind of, what called diversification. But what I was thinking, because, what he say that, the diversification of the households means that, it is taking the multiple activities for enhancing their incomes, and that is the strategy which is growingly being used by the households after I think 2011-12. Dr. Binod would like to also see the kind of things. I think this is a very interesting story. But I think what he should also like to think also, that this story has to be connected with the withdrawal of labor force from the labor market, particularly in rural India, and that too of the women labor force. And I think there is a huge decline of women workers in rural India between 2011-12 and 2017-18, and there is a little bit uptick, and those who have been, they are the unpaid family worker, and they were working in agriculture. So I think that kind, whether this kind of withdrawal, you are not capturing this kind of withdrawal, which can be the kind of limited diversification is happening. So your whole story shows me that something is going great, but many people are leaving the rural labor markets, and that needs to be, I think, taken well care of this while you are dealing with the kind of the picture of, because your diversification, your diversification story is saying that there is a bridging of gap between incomes of agricultural households and those who are non-agricultural households over the years. It means everything is happening very nicely. So it is basically due to the kind of easing of supply of the labor market due to the lack of demand, and that is what wages are there. So that is the lack of employment opportunity. How it is affecting this thing needs to be elaborated. Another thing I think what he very importantly addressed is that is the question of urbanization. And there is one thing which is happening, that urbanization basically now a lot of rural occupational portfolios are being determined by the daily commuters. So you see the kind of daily commuting is with that rapid transport increase in the access to transport in rural India. So there is a huge number in daily commuters. So these daily commuters, where you are counting them, either in the rural areas or urban areas. So I think these daily employment may not per se be in rural India, but it may be located somewhere nearby peri-urban, urban India. So that is the one thing, I think one has to see that, how this kind of daily commuting is impacting on their lively employment portfolios. And then other thing I think, which is reflected is that there is a diversification. If you are talking about diversification, And if you're talking of that, number of people are shifting from agriculture, but even within the agriculture also, you will find that it is a crop sector which is declining, whereas a horticulture, fisheries, which have a larger market linkages, which are the larger linkages, the other income avenues. I think these are the sectors which are basically pushing up the agriculture income of the households of those incomes. I think that he would like to see this kind of minor point, that why this income basically of this agriculture households has improved, because they have diversified within the agriculture, and that's what their incomes are improving. I had some couple of things on basically the questions related, and these questions, as he rightly pointed out, it is a policy dilemma, and this policy dilemma basically is related to that whether this diversification in rural India is basically improving incomes or not. If it is if it is leading to the increase in income, then what is the gap between the rural and urban India? That gap, because we want to compare the gap between the wages and income of rural and urban India, because that will trigger the mobility of labor. What you are saying, the mobility of labor, that will trigger the mobility of labor from rural to urban India. I think is it there that that there is a gap is decreasing, but the wage gap is decreasing between rural and urban India? That I think you would like to reflect on that. And then another important thing, I think, that is from the perspective of a policy perspective, is that there are a number of government programs which are aimed at promoting the development. There are many development schemes which are aimed at promoting the rural non-farm employment and even agriculture employment also. So what is the particularly skill development programs, MSME development programs? What is the impact? I think it appears that that it has a very limited impact on changing the portfolio of employment in rural India. So one would like to reflect on that, and because if these achievements are slow, then what could be the kind of policy messages? Because the kind of general strategy which you are adopting, that you do the skill development programs, you improve, you push up the microcredit, everything you are pushing up, but you are not getting the desired results. If there's something new is required, I think where you rightly pointed out this policy dilemma, I think that he would like to reflect on that. I think these are a couple of my points. And another thing which I wanted to have is basically on land issue. Land is going to be the kind of scarce commodity in that. And what he's saying that most of the households, those who are having a marginal or landless household, they have the mixed income households. So whether Professor Binod would like to demonstrate all these impact of different variables, say land, the kind of skill portfolio of the individuals, the age cohort, the kind of location of household. If he can demonstrate it through the simple the kind of logistic regression, he will get the more clear picture that what is the exact likelihood of your household having a better portfolio, say the kind of better income portfolio in a rural India if he is having certain conditions. That will give the kind of concrete direction towards taking any kind of policy measures. With these words, I'll thank you very much for your kind questions.
Thank you, sir, for your comments and suggestions, particularly bringing in the issue of labor force participation rate, which would even make this paper much more comprehensive if it can be taken into account. So I would now request Dr. Sangeeta Ghosh to make her comments.
Thanks. Thanks, Vinod, for your presentation and for your paper. So I'm not summarizing the paper, as you've done it yourself. So first of all, I'd like to say that since the COVID pandemic year was one, which had pandemic-induced lockdowns throughout that year, and the survey year also was from July 2020 to June 2021, I would like to read the paper, even while I was reading your paper, slightly separately than the rest of the years, which are perhaps more comparable. So the year 2017-18 would be, in my view, to be seen a little differently than the pandemic comparison that is there. So just one thing I wanted to point out here was the construction sector sees a huge jump in 2009-10. where the proportion of workers employed in the sector doubles from 2004-5 levels. So this is like 6.8 to 11.3% for males and 1.5 to 5.2% for female workers. And in the construction sector itself, you have shown that buildings of own account for the UTSS category, the growth in employment there was high. The percentage distribution of employment there was high. But for the subsidiary category, what we see is that the jump between 1999, 2000 and 2021 is huge for both male and female in the other construction category, which is probably, which you say is probably large infrastructural investments. So here I'd like to kind of ask, I mean, would ask you, like, would you like to reflect on like the MGNREGA, for example, which was launched in 2006? Would you see an impact of this scheme on the diversification? Because MGNREGA, of course, was aimed as a diversification strategy to mitigate the risk precisely, right? So in that, how would you kind of fit in a scheme or analyze or look at a scheme like the MGNREGA, which of course has low wages? So the convergence in wages that you see across or consumption expenditure, actually, to be more precise, across agricultural and non-agricultural households and mixed households. For the mixed households and agricultural households, maybe the low wages also of NREGA would explain some of that. Women employment was actually high in NREGA program also. You also point out to the Prime Minister Gram Sadak Yojana, which was launched in 2000 again, So that has issues with road connectivity and building of rural roads. And there's a paper that you have pointed out in the reference list also. So I just wanted to ask that, since all these schemes were also seen as an employment diversification scheme per se, and not as something that would involve too much skilling of the labor force per se, how would you read that, particularly when you kind of try to make a case of the shift in employment, the line that Ranali also pointed out to, that the shift in employment, these break periods that you have pointed out. So I think I'd rest there.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Shamita, for adding these points for the discussion. So now I think the floor is open for questions and comments, if there is any. And then I would request Professor Abraham to respond to particularly the panelists and the questions, if any, which comes from the floor. If not, is okay, Shailendra.
Yeah. So I have just one clarificatory questions. One paper from Niti Aayog by Chand, that suggests that the contribution of rural manufacturing segment in terms of, their contribution in domestic product and even in output has surpassed has increased and surpassed the urban manufacturing output. But your findings suggest that in manufacturing, the employment in manufacturing, even including time spent on manufacturing activity, has not increased. So if you can explain something.
Anyone want to ask? Okay, so before handing over to Professor Abraham, I want to add one or two questions with this in this very interesting discussion. One is which, of course, Dr. Mrinalini has already pointed out, is that if people are moving out from agriculture to non-agriculture, and that is to construction, if it is giving higher income, why it is a mode of diversification, why they're not entirely shifting from agriculture to construction. This is one. The second is that if you see the growth of employment in construction sector, it continued till 2011-12, and then there is a decline. Now, of course, the share within the rural male employment, the share of construction may increase because there are no other opportunities. But is it that the growth of construction that is driving this diversification? Because if there is a fall in the growth of employment in construction, how do we explain? It may be reflected in higher share, but is the growth of construction driving this diversification or not? The second is regarding this COVID, I think that is it wise to conclude that the mixed household increased during COVID because of the pandemic? Because why it would happen? The options in non-agriculture actually was less during COVID, while agriculture was more or less doing well for quite some time. So why they would shift to this mixed strategy? The third is that when you showed the share of land holding, it has increased from agricultural households to non-agricultural households. So some kind of shift is happening in terms of land ownership. The point is that, of course, income of non-agricultural households increasing, so there is a shift. But this shift in ownership, does it say that the use of land also has changed? In the sense that what you were hinting upon, that land, instead of a productive input, it is becoming an asset. If this shift happened, whether that conclusion can be drawn from this only, that was my question. So over to you, Professor Abraham.
One more
Okay,
hand
sorry.
size.
Yes, Raka.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was actually an excellent presentation by Professor Abraham. I am from ICR, National Institute of Agricultural Economics and Policy Research, and we have also been working in similar areas. So the study, it illustrates that a lot of diversification is happening in rural employment, and people are diversifying from agriculture to non-agriculture. But I could see in one of the slides that even non-agricultural households are diversifying themselves, particularly during this period of COVID pandemic, when this non-farm sector was highly volatile. So people shifted back to agriculture. So it is diversification is seen in both agriculture as well as non-agriculture to minimize the shocks, vulnerabilities, and risk. And one more thing which Mralani has already pointed out, that again, there are a number of changes from 2021 to 21-22. So from 2021, where share of agriculture was close to 46.5%, it has come down to 45.5. So this period has been highly uncertain from 2017-18 to 2021-22. Now, when we compare this with the regular surveys till 2011-12, and NSSO has already changed the mode of surveys to PLFS. So we are relying largely on that data. So maybe something is coming from those quick surveys, but actually this period has been highly volatile. So the selection of period is also making a difference. So we must also include the changes beyond 2021, and also we may attribute these changes to the global uncertainties and the domestic uncertainties in terms of COVID pandemic and the other things which are happening in the economy. But this was an excellent presentation by Professor Vinod.
Okay, so it is already 4:55. So I'd request Vinod to respond some of these issues which has been raised.
Yes. First of all, let me thank all the commentators, Dr. Mrinalini, Mamgen sir, and Dr. Sangeeta, for the comments that you have given. All the comments are very well taken. Thank you for all the comments. I won't be able to respond to most of them because I need to work further. That's what the comments. All the comments seems to be telling that there is further work required to answer many of these questions. Right? But let me make some conjunctures and then try to, probably when I do further analysis, I will be able to speak more on what is actually happening. Some of the aspects I would I can kind of think about is the question about what Dr. Mrinalini had highlighted with regard to individual and the household and the diversification versus the shift question, right? So one point that seems to be repeated by Dr. Satyaki also is this, that why is it that households are shifting at all? If income levels are high, then why is it that they have to shift? If suppose construction workers are getting higher pay, then why is it that entire shift doesn't occur and it's only a diversification that takes place? Now, of course, it requires further analysis. But one way of thinking about this that uh, um, your food in agriculture is always what you're getting from agriculture is actually real income, not in monetary terms. So once you are when if you are a food producer, that actually in an economy where your food prices or the availability, if there are scarcity of food or any form of food related issues, or their price or the quality of food, any of these issues, actually if you are kind of place yourself in food production, then it kind of protects you from the vagaries that are associated with agriculture production, right? So, and there is this agriculture household models are there, which talks about this thing, which where how when there is price uncertainty or any of the markets, not only the output markets, any of the input markets or the output market, if they are not properly integrated in the market, then there is a possibility that households would become self-employed in the agriculture sector itself. Now, diversification, that is why probably households are diversified, while individuals seems to be specialized. That individuals seems to be trying to earn more, where those individuals that can earn more, they seems to be going out, but they also keep ensure that food production continues within the household so that their basics are kind of met. So probably that is one way to think, but of course one needs to look into it, and that is an interesting way that what Dr. Mulanli had suggested, that is age wise and gender wise is one way of looking at it. So it will give you more indications about whether that is what is happening, some more indications about that is possible. Now, in the same lane of thought, Mamgen sir, what you had said about withdrawal of women, I think very true that I need to consider that into the analysis. I mean, when I talk about, in fact, in one of my earlier papers, I do look into this thing. But when we say that households are moving from agriculture to non-agriculture, essentially, what we are saying is that males are moving out of non-agriculture sector, and females are actually withdrawing from work itself. So withdrawal is actually happening in those households where males are actually able to move in the non-agriculture sector, while females are withdrawing from work itself. So this essentially is part of that transformation story, and I completely agree with that. But yes, we could actually bring more of that into the analysis also, and that could make it much richer. Daily commuting, yes. The data, of course, it is collected at the household level. So you're basically looking at the residents. So the data is about the residents, but whether more number of people are actually commuting to work, yes, there is some evidence also which shows migration data do show that there is more commuting that is going on, right? But is it entirely about commuting? That is something that we need to look into this thing further. Yes, there is some evidence on that thing also. And also, yeah, about the crop diversification story that we were talking about, I think I completely agree with that crop diversification, and about, yeah, I mean, some form of modeling at the end. I think that would be helpful. But I'll try that out at a later point. I want to get more into the data, then get some clarity on the data, and then I want to do some kind of modeling. But yeah, I will be looking into this thing, right? And comparing between the pandemic data and the rest of the data. Yes, I do agree that, Dr. Sangeet, that 2021 seems to be an aberration, seems to be in the rest of the analysis, right? But I was aware of it, that the 2021 data was standing out, but I still wanted to throw it in because I didn't feel that one should not throw away data what is available. That's the whole point. I mean, it may not gel well with the six. So that's also the response to Dr. Akka Saksena's question about whether this data, whether the 2017, 19, and 2021, whether they are comparable. Yes, I mean, PLFS and NSS. The question about whether NSS and PLFS can be compared. At the very broad level, even though the PLFS document does say that NSS and PLFS are not comparable, I think when there is nothing available, you should use what is there. I mean, there is no point in running away when there is lack of data. There is no point in saying that, okay, we don't have, we take the caveats and then try analysis. Of course, with the caveats only. I mean, we say that that this is PLFS data, this is not entirely. The sampling has changed slightly compared to NSS, but we also know this thing. These are large samples, and large samples, when the sample size keeps increasing, the possibility of comparison also becomes better, right? So you have large samples. NSS is a large sample, PLF is a large sample. Sampling may have changed. I mean, basically, the underlying population is the same. So if you keep on increasing the sample size, then this thing should become comparable at some point. Then if it has come across that the everything is looking positive, as Rajendra sir, Mangesh sir said, that's not the picture that I was trying to draw to. But if it has, that's how it has come out, then I'm to be blamed. I was trying to say that there is diversification that is taking place essentially to construction sector, and these are not actually positive signs. These are actually, there is diversification, but in the initial I said the mobility story is actually shift. When people are actually, entire households are able to move, they have occupational mobility, they can move, they become better. But that's not seems to be the story that is coming. The people are, yes, they are, when there is a fall in income, people try to do many things. They try to diversify their income, they try to find something or the other. But that's the story that I'm trying to convey. But if it has not reached that point, then I have to kind of get myself better on these things. Then about the question about Niti Aayog's paper, that Professor Ramesh Chand's paper on rural manufacturing. Yes, rural manufacturing seems to be increasing. That data is actually based on the annual survey of industry that's been showing for quite some time. Actually, the rural manufacturing is increasing, right? But in terms of employment, whether it is increasing or not, that seems to be looked at. The data from PLFS or the NSS data also doesn't show that rural manufacturing employment has increased, right? Output share seems to be increasing, and that output share seems to be coming from the extrapolations that is done from the ASI data, right? In ASI, actually, rural manufacturing seems to be increasing. That is there. But for all data that associated with GSDP calculations for in the organized sector comes from the ASI. And in the manufacturing sector, in the ASI is what organized manufacturing sector, ASI is the story that we follow, and GSDP calculation also comes from there. And probably that is why the share of rural manufacturing in the GSDP seems to be increasing. But I have come across at least one or two other studies which shows that actually rural manufacturing is increasing using the ASI data. And in one of those studies, one or two of those studies, it was interesting to see this thing. Actually, yes, it is increasing, but this increase is essentially in the peri-urban. What Amgesh sir was saying, it is actually the peri-urban rural areas that the rural manufacturing sector seems to be increasing, probably because of the onslaught, the environmental and the consumer movements and all those things that is going on in the urban. Basically, what in CSRD, what we used to call as peripheralization and all those stories around that. That seems to be the story as well. And the last set of comments, Dr. Satikiji's comments, I think I have talked about shift and construction sector also I have talked about. The share of land use pattern, whether this is whether this shift is occurring whether it is a speculative use or not, I actually don't know. I don't know whether this is used for speculative purpose or I'm also actually speculating. But the point that I want to make is here is that the way I have classified these households, non-agriculture households, none of the members are working in agriculture. No member should be working in agriculture. So my guess is that if they are not working, then either someone else should be working on that land that they are using it probably properly, or possibly, I think what is increasingly happening is, my sense is this thing. See, the demand for land is actually increasing. You have rural roads coming in, you have markets increasing, your infrastructure building that is also land as something that is very, very much there in Kerala right now. Kerala, the most expensive thing to buy here in Kerala is land, and land is not used for any productive purpose. Most of land lying vacant. Land is just left vacant. No one is taking interest in agriculture because they know that if they sell off the land, it is much more profitable in 3 years' time rather than you invest on land. So what people do is actually buy land, keep it for 2, 3 or 4 years, sell it off. That's a much better outcome. That is the speculative, speculative purpose of land seems to be better paying than actually productive use of land itself. So I don't know whether that is happening across the country, but that seems there is some evidence of that in Kerala, and there are some studies. So I was kind of extrapolating to the rest of the country. Probably this is happening it has started happening in the rest of the country also. But this has been happening in Kerala for quite some time. It's not a recent. In fact, if you go to any places nearby Kerala, in Kerala, first thing is what you see is crop shifting from paddy to coconut or rubber or something like that, and then leave the land like that for many years, some 10 or 15 years, so that the land gets filled up. And once the land is filled up, you sell off the land at a much higher price, because land prices are huge here and keeps on rising. So some strategy that seems to be linked to speculation, that seems to be maybe one way of thinking about it. I think there are many other questions that were asked, but I need to do further analysis on the one hand, and I also need to kind of spend probably more time to give answers to all these questions. I'm really thankful to all the questions that were raised. I know it doesn't help you, but it certainly helps me. Thank you very much for the opportunity again, Dr. Satyaki and ISID for this opportunity. There are a few questions in the chat box, but I don't know whether we have the time to do that. That the moderator can decide on that. Thank you very much. We can't hear you.
Sorry. So what are there in the chat box? Most of them are comments. So you can. I don't think there are questions. So most of them. So if someone really wants to raise a question, let me check once. Okay, but there is always a time limit and we have to close the discussion. So I think Professor Abraham would take account of some of these comments and questions. And you can also write to him, anyone who wants to engage with him in a discussion on this. So at the end, I once again thank Professor Vinod Abraham for his excellent presentation, and also Professor Mamgain, Dr. Mrinalini and Dr. Sangita for their comments and suggestions. It was really a wonderful discussion. I think all of us enjoyed that. And I also thank all the participants for supporting us in this ISID research seminar, which happens twice a month. So keep on supporting us and engage with us intellectually in these discussions in the future as well. Thank you.
Can I take one last word, please? I just want to thank Beena, Dr. Beena of ISID. She's the one actually who pushed me into getting to this seminar this time. So thank you, Beena, for pushing me to do this. And thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So we close here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye, Vinod. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir. Bye, sir.
Bye-bye.
All your gang is here in Trivandrum. Your full gang is here in Trivandrum only. There is some here in
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Trivandrum gang is here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.